General Hospital will reveal Drew had spent months carefully crafting a meticulous plan for revenge against Portia, the woman he believed was behind the drugging incident that had caused him severe harm. After waking from a coma and realizing he had been manipulated, Drew couldn't accept the betrayal and manipulation by someone he once trusted. This wasn't just an attack on his honor but had severely affected his relationships with those around him. As a result, Drew was determined to make Portia pay. He knew the only way to expose her was to reveal all the dark secrets she was hiding and destroy her life and career. To execute this plan, Drew reached out to Brad, a man he had worked with on many occasions in the past. Brad, with his greedy and power-hungry nature, immediately agreed to assist Drew, but only on one condition: a hefty sum of money in exchange for the crucial information Drew needed. Drew, although aware of Brad's greed, had no other choice but to agree. He immediately paid Brad a substantial sum of $500,000 for the information that would expose Portia's role in the drugging. With the money in hand, Brad didn't just provide Drew with a few vague leads. He uncovered something Drew had never anticipated. Through his own covert investigation, Brad discovered that Portia was the one who had hired Jacinda, the woman responsible for drugging Drew, which left him in a vulnerable, uncontrollable state. In reality, Portia had been the mastermind behind the entire scheme, not just to harm Drew, but to protect her own personal interests, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. This revelation infuriated Drew, but it also fueled his determination to carry out the revenge plan. The information Brad provided wasn't just enough to expose Portia, it gave Drew all the tools he needed to publicly humiliate her and tear apart her career and personal life. Drew knew that by revealing these secrets, Portia would have no way to escape the consequences. Her shady actions, her lies, and her attempts to cover up her wrongdoings would be exposed for all to see. However, Drew wasn't the only one benefiting from this. Brad knew full well that his betrayal could lead to a massive payday, so he continued to push Drew forward with the plan. If the plan succeeded, Brad would receive another $1,000 as a reward for his assistance. Brad's greed and eagerness to profit from the situation kept him supplying Drew with valuable information, bringing him closer and closer to exposing the truth about Portia. Drew, with his relentless determination, began making final preparations for his attack. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. But the more he thought about what Portia had done to him, the more driven he became. Every step Drew took was carefully calculated, from gathering evidence, preparing for the public expose at the hospital, to ensuring that Portia would have no way to wriggle out of the impending fallout. Drew was determined to leave no stone unturned. Knowing that there would be no turning back now, he had no choice but to move forward. With everything set in motion, Drew began the process of unveiling the truth. He knew that things would get intense when the truth was exposed, but that was the price Portia had to pay for her actions. Drew wasn't hesitant, although deep down, he knew that Brad's betrayal could become the biggest turning point of his life. Because of this, Drew had to make sure nothing would deter him from completing his mission. Everything had gone too far for him to stop, and Drew knew he wouldn't stop until Portia paid. The plan had been set, the truth was about to be revealed. And Drew was confident that all he needed was one decisive blow to finish everything. But the question remained, could Brad keep his promise and help Drew see this plan through? Or would he become the biggest threat to Drew's success? The next steps in this story promised to be a tense battle between greed, betrayal, and justice. However, things did not unfold as Drew had anticipated. Just as he was gearing up for the public expose, Brad had a fateful encounter with Curtis that would change everything. Curtis, always a staunch believer in honesty and despising secrecy, had been suspicious of Drew's recent actions for some time. As a man of integrity, he couldn't stand by knowing that something shady was happening without stepping in. Brad, sensing Curtis's growing mistrust, found himself in a moment of weakness and fear. The weight of his conscience, coupled with the growing pressure from Curtis, led him to make a decision that would ultimately betray Drew. Brad, initially eager to secure his financial reward from Drew, began to falter under the mounting tension. Curtis had already pieced together the puzzle and suspected that Brad was involved in something that could bring serious consequences for everyone involved. In a desperate moment of panic, Brad saw an opportunity to save himself, and with a heavy heart, he decided to abandon Drew. Instead of continuing to support Drew's plan, Brad chose to inform Curtis about every detail of Drew's scheme. This decision would not only cost Drew his chance at revenge but also set the stage for a confrontation that Drew had never seen coming. Brad's betrayal opened a window of opportunity for Curtis to prepare himself to face Drew, giving him the upper hand in the situation. Unaware of the treachery unfolding behind his back, Drew remained completely trusting of Brad. He had no reason to suspect that his ally had turned on him. Brad had always been a loyal partner in the past, and Drew was counting on him to provide the information and backup necessary to carry out his plan. With this trust in place, Drew continued to move forward, confident that he was on the right path. His plan was about to come to fruition, and he had every intention of exposing Portia for the manipulative and deceitful person he believed her to be. Drew's next move was crucial. He had invited Curtis to the hospital, not just for a business discussion but because he wanted Curtis to witness the public revelation he had been planning. Drew thought that by showing Curtis the secrets he had uncovered about Portia, he could both humiliate her and secure his own victory. He was determined to make this exposure unforgettable, something that would leave an indelible mark on Portia's reputation and career. Drew believed that by forcing her to face the truth in front of her colleagues and peers, he would finally get the justice he so desperately craved. As the day of the confrontation arrived, Drew prepared himself mentally for the dramatic moment he had been anticipating. He had all the evidence lined up and was ready to take down Portia once and for all. He was so confident that nothing could go wrong that he didn't even entertain the possibility of betrayal. Drew entered the hospital with a sense of purpose, knowing that he was about to turn the tables on Portia and expose her to the world. However, what Drew didn't realize was that the moment he walked into the hospital, the dynamic had already shifted. Brad's betrayal had already given Curtis a head start. And while Drew was oblivious to the shifting tides, Curtis was ready to confront him. Curtis had spent the days leading up to this moment preparing for the showdown. He knew that Drew had been planning something underhanded, and now, armed with knowledge of the plot, Curtis was ready to face him head-on. Drew approached Portia, full of confidence, ready to expose her with the evidence he had carefully gathered. The tension in the room was palpable as Drew began to reveal everything he had learned about her actions, how she had orchestrated the drugging of Drew, how she had manipulated events to cover her tracks, and how she had lied to everyone to protect herself. He relished the thought of watching her squirm in front of everyone. Drew believed this was the moment of ultimate victory, where all the lies would come crashing down. But as Drew prepared to deliver his final blow, he saw Curtis standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Drew paused, his heart suddenly sinking. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Curtis, without a word, stepped forward and, in a calm but firm voice, confronted Drew. The truth hit Drew like a ton of bricks as Curtis revealed that he had known about the entire scheme for days. Brad's betrayal had allowed Curtis to prepare for this moment. And now Drew was the one left exposed. Curtis's voice was filled with anger and disappointment as he made it clear that Drew had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The room grew silent as Drew's facade of control cracked. His plans had backfired, and instead of the public humiliation of Portia that he had envisioned, he found himself standing alone, facing the consequences of his own manipulation and betrayal. The truth had come out, but it wasn't the truth Drew had expected to reveal. It was his own downfall that now lay bare before everyone. In that moment, Drew realized that the betrayal he had feared from others had come from the one person he had trusted the most. Brad's decision to turn on him, driven by fear and self-preservation, had completely unraveled Drew's plans. What he thought would be his triumphant moment of revenge had become his undoing. Now, not only was Portia safe from the exposure he had planned, but Drew found himself in a situation where the tables had turned, and his own actions were being scrutinized by those he once considered allies. ChatGPT de NOI. At the hospital, Drew stormed into the meeting of doctors and nurses, including Terry and Elizabeth, where the atmosphere was tense and full of routine administrative discussion. However, Drew had different intentions. With a fire in his eyes and a sense of relentless determination, he barged into the room, silencing the casual chatter. His presence, filled with urgency, immediately drew attention, and without wasting any time, he began to unravel the shocking truth about Portia. Drew, feeling empowered by the evidence he had carefully collected, took a deep breath and addressed everyone in the room. His voice was unwavering as he began to expose Portia's deepest, darkest secrets. He started with the most devastating revelation. Portia had hired Jacinda, a known troublemaker, to drug him, reducing him to a helpless state. He painted a vivid picture of how Portia had orchestrated the entire scheme, carefully plotting to keep him vulnerable while she continued to climb the social and professional ladder, all the while hiding behind her false persona of trustworthiness. Drew's words echoed in the room as he disclosed another damning truth: Portia had been behind the forgery of Heather Weber's test results. It was a deliberate act of deception to protect herself and to cover up her misdeeds. The gravity of these actions made Drew's voice even sharper, each accusation building upon the other, leaving Portia with nowhere to run. The lies she had been spinning for so long were now being pulled apart, piece by piece, under the weight of Drew's revelations. He had the evidence, and he wasn't about to let her hide anymore. Portia, who had been sitting quietly among the group, was now visibly shaken. Her face turned pale, her eyes widening as she processed the weight of what Drew was saying. She could feel the room closing in on her as Drew revealed the dark side of her manipulations. For someone so composed, it was a rare moment of vulnerability, and it sent shockwaves through her body. She had never imagined that Drew would come after her so openly, in front of so many people, without any hesitation. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out how to salvage the situation, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable, and her secret life was crumbling in front of her eyes. As Drew continued, his confidence grew. He believed that everything was going according to his plan. He had cornered Portia, exposed her for who she really was. And now he was about to relish in the satisfaction of watching her squirm under the weight of her lies. In his mind, this was the moment of ultimate justice, where all the pain he had endured would finally be avenged. But Drew was unaware of the twist that was about to change everything. What he didn't know was that Brad, the person he had trusted the most in this entire scheme, had betrayed him. Brad, whose loyalty had always been a key factor in Drew's confidence, had turned against him at the last moment. Curtis had discovered Brad's involvement, and in the wake of this betrayal, he had prepared himself to confront Drew. Curtis, who had always valued truth and loyalty, was now standing in the hospital, ready to confront Drew with the full extent of his actions. As Drew continued to press forward, confident that he was winning, Curtis entered the room. The tension between the two men was palpable. Curtis, having already known about Drew's plan, stepped forward and locked eyes with him. Drew froze for a moment, the sudden confrontation catching him off guard. Curtis's expression was cold, a mix of betrayal and disbelief in his eyes as he took in the full scope of Drew's manipulations. Drew, not understanding the significance of Curtis's presence, pressed on with his accusations, believing that he was still in control. But as he spoke, Curtis's anger boiled over. The realization that Drew had been working in the shadows, plotting against Portia with such ruthless determination, ignited a fire in Curtis. Drew, in his self-assured triumph, failed to recognize that the very person he had hoped to rely on had already turned the tables on him. Just as Drew felt the momentum shifting in his favor, the unexpected happened. The doors to the room swung open, and in walked Max Scorpio, accompanied by police officers. Drew's heart sank as Max's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Portia. You're under arrest for your actions," Mac announced, and the room went silent. The reality of the situation hit Drew like a ton of bricks. The plan he had worked so hard on had backfired in ways he never anticipated. The authorities had arrived, and Portia, instead of being the one to face public humiliation and disgrace, was now being escorted out of the hospital in handcuffs. Mac's words echoed in Drew's mind, "We have all the evidence we need to charge her. She's facing serious criminal charges. And it could mean a long prison sentence." Drew's smug satisfaction quickly turned to shock and confusion. Portia, whom he had been so sure was on the verge of being completely exposed, was now the one in control of the situation. Drew looked at Portia, his face momentarily lighting up with a sense of victory, but he was quickly struck by the realization that he had been outplayed. He hadn't just lost this battle, he had lost everything. What he thought was his moment of triumph had been taken from him in an instant. He looked around the room. The faces of those who had witnessed the confrontation, all now filled with disbelief and disappointment. But it wasn't just the shock of seeing Portia arrested that rattled Drew. Curtis, standing behind him, was seething with rage. His eyes, full of fury, locked onto Drew with an intensity that made Drew's blood run cold. Curtis had been betrayed by the woman he loved. But what he saw in front of him now was too much. Drew had manipulated everyone, and Curtis could no longer control his anger. In a sudden, explosive moment, Curtis swung his fist at Drew, landing a solid punch right across his face. The impact of the blow echoed throughout the room, and Drew stumbled back, caught off guard by the sheer force of Curtis's anger. The punch wasn't just about physical pain, it was a release of everything Curtis had been feeling. Betrayal, frustration, and years of bottled-up anger poured out in that one, swift motion. Drew had orchestrated the downfall of Portia, but in the process, he had destroyed everything that mattered to him. Now, standing before Curtis, Drew felt the full weight of his own actions. The room was thick with tension as Drew tried to steady himself, blood trickling from his lip. The people in the room watched in stunned silence as Curtis, shaking with emotion, stood over Drew. The sense of inevitability in the air was palpable. Drew had lost. His betrayal of trust, his thirst for revenge, and his manipulation of those around him had come full circle, and now he was the one left broken, physically and emotionally. Portia was being taken away, and Drew was left standing there, facing the consequences of his actions, his plans crumbling around him. He had thought he could destroy Portia's life, but in the end, it was his own life that had been shattered. Drew had meticulously crafted his plan for revenge, believing that his actions would bring him the justice he so desperately craved. He had invested months of preparation, laying out every detail with precision, gathering evidence, and aligning the necessary players to execute his grand scheme. The target was clear: Portia, the woman he believed was behind his drugging and the destruction of his life. He had painstakingly gathered the pieces to expose her, and in his mind, once everything was revealed, he would finally feel the satisfaction of seeing her life come crashing down. But what Drew hadn't accounted for was betrayal. His unwavering trust in Brad, the person he had relied on most to bring the plan to fruition, would be his undoing. Brad, the very person Drew had believed to be loyal to him, chose to betray him at the last possible moment. It was a betrayal that Drew had not seen coming. And it shattered his world in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Drew's confidence had been his downfall. He was so certain of his success, so sure that his meticulously crafted plot would unfold without a hitch, that he never considered the possibility of Brad turning against him. Brad, who had taken Drew's money and promised to help him expose Portia, had decided to make a deal with Curtis instead. In a moment of weakness and fear, Brad had revealed everything to Curtis, knowing full well that doing so would destroy Drew's chances of success. Brad's fear of facing the consequences of their actions, coupled with his own self-preservation instincts, led him to turn on Drew at the most critical moment. When Drew entered the hospital with the intent to expose Portia, he had no idea that everything had already changed. Brad's betrayal had already set the wheels in motion for his downfall. Drew believed he was about to achieve the ultimate victory, yet in reality, he was stepping into a trap that he had unknowingly set for himself. As he stood in front of Portia, ready to reveal her secrets, he had no idea that Curtis was already aware of his plan and had been preparing to confront him. Drew's confidence in his scheme blinded him to the fact that everything had already been sabotaged from within. When Curtis stepped forward to confront him, Drew was momentarily thrown off balance. Curtis's cold gaze and the palpable tension in the air were the first signs that something was terribly wrong. But Drew, ever the optimist in his own success, dismissed the feeling of unease. He pressed forward, revealing Portia's darkest secrets to the room, fully expecting to watch her squirm in front of everyone. But what Drew didn't realize was that his grand moment of triumph was quickly turning into his greatest failure. The police arrived, led by Mac, and with them, the crushing blow to Drew's carefully laid plans. Portia, instead of being the one to face public humiliation, was now being arrested for her crimes. Drew's sense of victory evaporated in an instant as he realized that everything he had worked for had unraveled before his very eyes. He had thought this was the moment when Portia's life would fall apart, but instead, it was Drew who found himself on the losing side. Watching as the woman he had plotted to destroy was escorted away by the police. Drew's heart sank as he looked around the room, seeing the faces of the people who had witnessed his failure. Curtis's expression was one of disgust, a mixture of anger and disappointment as he watched Drew's plan crumble. The betrayal, the lies, and the manipulation that had led Drew to this point were all laid bare. Drew had believed that he could outsmart everyone, but in the end, it was his own arrogance and misplaced trust in Brad that had led to his downfall. The true weight of Drew's failure became evident as he realized the consequences of his actions. His pursuit of revenge had consumed him, clouding his judgment and making him blind to the risks of betrayal. Not only had he failed to achieve the satisfaction of exposing Portia, but he now faced the very real prospect of losing everything. The secrets he had uncovered about Portia, the evidence he had gathered, were now useless. Rendered moot by the intervention of the police and Curtis's timely confrontation, Drew's entire world was falling apart. The anger that had fueled his quest for revenge now turned into regret and self-loathing. He had crossed a line that he could never undo. And the fallout from his actions would haunt him for years to come. Not only had he lost his battle with Portia, but he had also lost his own sense of integrity. His blind pursuit of vengeance had led him to destroy his relationship with Brad, the person he had trusted above all others. That betrayal would weigh heavily on Drew's conscience for the rest of his life, and he knew that he would never be able to escape the shadow of his own mistakes. Drew had believed that his actions would restore his sense of justice, but instead, they had brought him to a place of complete devastation. His revenge had not only failed but had also left him with nothing but the wreckage of his own life. The emotional cost of his plan, the damage to his relationships, and the realization that he had been the architect of his own destruction were all painfully clear. Drew's pursuit of revenge had been a bitter, empty victory, one that had come at the cost of his own soul. In the end, Drew lost everything. His plans, his trust, his dignity, gone. And the consequences of his actions would linger long after the dust had settled, a constant reminder of the man he had become and the price he had paid for his obsession with vengeance. Drew had set out to destroy Portia, but in the end, it was his own destruction that was most evident.